Richard Nixon, crook, foreign policy genius, power abuser, above the law. Richard Nixon, the only president to resign, also claims, when a president does it, that means it's not illegal. Richard Nixon had political success with foreign policy, but he left a negative legacy because of the Watergate scandal, and he made people lose trust in the government. Richard Nixon attended Whittier High School and graduated second in his class. He ended up receiving a scholarship to Harvard, but he didn't have enough money to go. He ended up attending Whittier College, and after graduating, he received a full scholarship to Duke University. During Nixon's political career, he held many jobs, like Nixon was the man in the Alger Hiss case who was supposed to try and find documents to prove Alger Hiss was communist. In 1950, Richard Nixon ran for the U.S. Senate. He ended up winning the election. President Dwight Eisenhower liked Nixon and his eye for detail. Nixon ended up being vice president for 2 terms. President Richard Nixon faced many political defeats. He ended up running against Kennedy in the 1960 election and ended up losing. Then he also ran for governor of California, and the results were embarrassing. He lost by 300,000 votes in 1962. After many losses, Richard Nixon suffered from paranoia. He ended up never trusting anyone. Richard Nixon, being the man that he was, he had Henry Kissinger travel secretly to China to arrange a meeting. Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State for many years. Kissinger negotiated a ceasefire in Vietnam for the Vietnam War. Nixon traveled to China after Kissinger traveled there to arrange a meeting. They visited with Mao Zedong and their Prime Minister Zhou Enlai and signed the Shanghai Communique that said they would set aside differences and begin the process with normalizing relations between them. After Nixon had gone to China, the USSR suddenly wanted to improve relations. This allowed Nixon to become the first president to go to Moscow. He was invited by Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev to engage in peace talks. The two of them signed an anti-ballistic missile treaty, an agreement to limit nuclear weapons. They signed the treaty that led to the first SALT talks. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Each nation understand the other nation's desires for limitations of weaponry. The first meetings were held in the years of 1969 and 1972. Nixon established a plan that permanently established trade between China and the U.S. Today, America has an open trade policy with China in the United Nations. America eased tensions with Russia by détente. Détente was the theme of the foreign relations, and it helped them start to limit the nuclear weapons.
Nixon was very suspicious of people because they had liberal ideas, so he made up an enemies list. Charles W. Colson helped develop the list, but the list was made up of prominent people who were seen unsympathetic to the Nixon administration. Senator Edward Kennedy, reporters like Daniel Score, and performers like Dick Gregory, Jane Fonda, and Steve McQueen were some examples that were on the list. His staff had to protect him at all costs from things that may harm his political career. These people on the enemies list were harassed in various ways, like IRS audits. The Plumbers were an organization established by John Ehrlichman. They were the White House Secret Police Force or Special Investigation Unit. The Plumbers were created after Nixon's first term because there was sensitive military information that was leaked, like the Pentagon Papers. These papers revealed secrets about the Vietnam War. The tasks of the Plumbers were to burglarize Daniel Ellsberg's office, Hunt's investigation of Teddy Kennedy's affair, and Liddy's investigation of the assassination of South Vietnamese President Diem. Nixon was a paranoid president who wanted the Democrats' secrets to secure his win for the 1972 elections. The first break-in of the Watergate scandal was recorded 3 weeks before the second break-in. 7 men participated in the first Watergate scandal. Gordon Liddy was a former FBI agent, E. Howard Hunt had retired from the CIA, James McCord would handle the bugging, Bernard Barker would photograph documents, and Virgilio Gonzalez would pick the locks. The remaining 2, Eugenio Martinez and Frank Sturgis, would serve as lookouts. The re-election committee, also known as CREEP, attempted to install listening devices. However, the devices failed. The second break-in was on June 17, 1972, was to fix the listening devices. Guard Frank Wills for the Watergate building noticed that someone had taped the building's lock, thinking it was left for the cleaning crew. But when he returned, he found the tapes he removed had been replaced. Knowing that something was wrong, Frank Wills then called the police. The police came just in time and arrested 5 of the burglars. Nixon worked very hard to cover up the break-in. Reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein wrote front-page stories exposing links between the burglary and Nixon's campaign organization. CREEP raised hush money for the burglars. On August 1, 1972, a $25,000 check for the Nixon re-election campaign was found in the bank account of one of the Watergate burglars. On October 19, 1973, Nixon ordered Archibald Cox, a special prosecutor, to be fired, also known as Saturday Night Massacre. On November 17, 1973, Richard Nixon gave a televised press conference informing Americans that he isn't a crook, at the end of a lengthy response to a question about his personal finances. On November 21, 1973, the White House reported that 18.5 minutes of tape recording were erased of a conversation between the President and H.R. Hadelman that was dated just 3 days after the Watergate burglary. Prosecutors wanted Nixon's White House tapes because that would prove that Nixon was guilty of his crimes. April 1974, 1,200 pages of edited transcripts of the Nixon tapes were released by the White House to the House Judiciary Committee. The committee insisted that the tapes themselves must be turned over to the Supreme Court. They ruled unanimously that Nixon must turn over the tapes recordings of 64 White House conversations, rejecting the president's claim of exclusive privileges. Between July 27th through the 30th, the committee adopted 3 articles of impeachment: misuse of power, violation of its oath of office, and failure to comply with House subpoena. On August 5, 1974, Richard Nixon gave the tapes that proved evidence of the Watergate scandal. One of the tapes Richard Nixon handed over was the smoking gun. This tape was recorded 6 days after the break-in. In the tape, Hadelman said to Nixon, "The way to handle this now is for us to have Walters, CIA, call Pat Gray, FBI, and just say, 'Stay the hell out of this. This is our business. Here we don't want you to go any farther on it.'" Hadelman is ordering the CIA to stop the investigation of the FBI. On August 9, 1974, there was enough votes to remove Richard Nixon from the office. He then announced that he would resign from the presidency. Watergate forced Richard Nixon to be the only U.S. president in U.S. history to resign. The House of Representatives authorized the House Judiciary Committee to investigate whether to impeach President Nixon. Nixon stated, "When the president does it, that means it's not illegal." Richard Nixon thought the man of law didn't apply to him. Ultimately, 60 of Nixon's supporters were convicted of crimes from the Watergate scandal. Clearly, Watergate showed man was not above the law. After Watergate, the voter turnout dropped dramatically. In 1974, the turnout was averaged 45% in the midterm congressional election.
The Watergate scandal in America revealed that the U.S. Constitution worked and the freedom of the press kept the government accountable. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees the freedom of the press, and Americans would have never found out about the Watergate scandal had the Washington Post reporters not used their First Amendment rights. Because the Constitution balances the powers of the 3 government branches, the judicial branch made Nixon give up his tapes, and the legislative branch created the charges to impeach Nixon. In the end, Nixon tried to be above the law, but the law was above the man. That the U.S. government system works, and if one branch is corrupt, then the other branches will set it straight. People were reluctant to believe in their public officials, and they questioned the government's authority. The Freedom of Information Act states, it wasn't until 1974, after the Watergate scandal and the tight-lipped Nixon administration, that Congress amended the Freedom of Information Act to become the bill it is today. The Senate and the House introduced many new requirements, timeframes, sanctions for wrongly withheld information, and necessary language waiving fees for journalists and public interest groups. To sum up, Richard Nixon's legacy is negative because he is the only president to resign, his crimes were not unique, and he was the only one who got caught.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
We don't get